church, and I knew he graduated from Hope College. I think I knew that he got his PhD in U.S. political and diplomatic history from the University of Michigan. He's a former professor of history and vice president of planning and development at Muskingum.
Small Presbyterian College in Ohio.
Yes, yeah, in New Concord, Ohio, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, alma mater of John Glenn.
Yes. President and owner of a higher education consulting firm known as BMG Associates. He's author of numerous scholarly articles and a book entitled The Progressive Insurgents and the New Deal, 1933-1939. He is still an active member at the Lithuanian Christian College in Lithuania and the Boys and Girls Clubs of the Mississippi Valley in Moline, Illinois. So thank you, Ron, and Ron's going to introduce Linda today.
Thank you. I think I'm
you
good
got
here.
mine.
Yeah. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, colleague. I'm going to try in 15 minutes to do a semester-long course called The History of Racism in the Civil War at Muskingum College. And as you read the old-fashioned précis that I made, try to figure out how we got from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, to Abraham Lincoln saying in 1858, a house divided against itself cannot stand. First of all, a little bit of history, looking at the causes of the Civil War and how historians have explained it, get in the weeds here a bit. First of all, a lot of people said it's totally because of economic differences, constitutional differences, states' rights. But you got to remember, almost all of the people involved in leading the country up to the Civil War were also involved in the Constitutional Convention. And the Constitution of the United States was put in place to have a stronger central government. The Articles of Confederation simply did not work. And the Constitution, whatever people want to say about it and how it's been amended and abused, the Constitution is, in my opinion, a true example of American exceptionalism. There is no other Republican/Democratic form of government over a large territory like this that has lasted this long. The precedents for constitutional Republican Democratic form of government were the city-states of Greece. So this is truly, this concept of federalism over a large territory is truly exceptional. But where does the authority really lie? With the federal government, with the state governments, with the local governments, and that's an ongoing debate. And there's no question that most of the Southerners before the Civil War called themselves states' rightists. Then some people say that, well, it was poor statesmanship. We had, leading up to the Civil War, we had presidents who weren't all that capable. And there's probably, when you look at that, there is some truth to that, but there are also some really noteworthy exceptions. For example, I happen to believe that John Quincy Adams was a wonderful president, and there's no question, although controversial, that Andrew Jackson was a noteworthy president as well. Then racism and slavery, which I think gets to the nub of it. Most people say, well, that's because the North was all abolitionist and the South was all pro-slavery. Well, there were very few abolitionists in the North, very, very few in the South. There's no question that every state in the Union had slavery at one time except Vermont. Almost every state in the Union, North or South, where South had slavery, North had black codes, which was a forerunner of Jim Crow, which appeared as a name to keep quote-unquote African Americans in check after the Civil War. And all of this played out in terms of the contest of a political contest, really, in terms of slavery in the territories. If you take a quick snapshot of the United States in 1860, there were 4 million Southern slaves, representing the largest single capital asset in the United States. Approximately 25% of Southerners were slaveholders. Only 5 or 6% of Southerners owned 25 or more slaves. Less than 17% of Northerners could be classified as abolitionists that wanted slavery eradicated as soon as possible. As I indicated earlier, both Northerners and Southerners had black codes. It's basically thought blacks were inferior. And economically, although in the northern part of the United States was much more entrepreneurial than the agrarian South, but most of the occupation were held by small white farmers in the North and in the South. Initially, in what became the United States, slavery was not uniquely relegated to blacks or Africans. We had indentured servitude. A few of those actually, although there was usually a contract that they came over and after working anywhere from 3 to 7 years, they were freed. There were a few, very few, but that remained permanent slaves for a variety of reasons. And in some areas of the country, there were Native Americans who were captured and were enslaved. That was much more of a prevalent practice in the Caribbean and South America than in the United States. But there were, as I said, racial codes both in the North and the South. Well, what about this wonderful Constitution that we have? And I stick by the conclusion that it is wonderful. But it basically codified slavery. The 3/5 clause, which really puffed up the representative possibilities in the Congress of the southern states. The international slave trade was guaranteed for 20 years, roughly 1808, and to the Jeffersonians' credit, in 1807, the international slave trade was abolished 1 year early. And there was a fugitive slave law written into the U.S. Constitution. That is, slaves who escaped were supposed to be captured and returned by northern state authorities, the federal government, et cetera, et cetera. So we did have a constitution that codified slavery. And not good, for sure. But on the other hand, given the, I always ask myself the question, could we have had this Constitution without giving some kind of nod at slavery at this particular time? And my answer is no. That doesn't mean that we should embrace slavery or should have ever embraced slavery, but it could not have happened if there hadn't been these and other compromises, mainly the small versus larger state, each state having 2 senators and so on and so forth. But out of this Constitution came kind of a marriage that we had to preserve the Constitution and the Union at all costs. Because however that was defined, that became the embodiment of democracy or eventually, majority rule. So following the Constitution, there was only one president and he accepted the role and was elected, George Washington. He was key to getting the government off the ground. Also, he was key in establishing a peaceful transition. He did one of the best things that any first president could ever do. After 2 terms, he went home. And he did contest the election, even though John Adams was a feisty guy, but he was also a Federalist. So John Adams took over, but the United States, even when Jefferson was elected in 1800, there was a lot of angst on whether or not we could actually keep this republic, because it was so unique, this republic over a large territory. Could we keep it? And then the founders didn't believe in political parties, which was as really intelligent and farsighted as they were. How they ever could have missed that one, I really don't know. But of course, political parties developed right away, and even in the late 1790s with the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, the Federalists generally took the side of the British, the Jeffersonians took the side of the French, and this led to the Alien and Sedition Acts in the United States in the late 1790s. And when Jefferson was elected, the author of the Declaration of Independence and a slaveholder, one congregational preacher in Connecticut prayed in front of his congregation for Thomas Jefferson, "O Lord, be with him, for thou knowest he needs it." I mean, there was real division amongst the parties at this particular time. So it wasn't unusual that this division in different ways, shapes, or form would continue. And the United States basically didn't get off, if you will, the schneid of maintaining whether this republic could exist until after the War of 1812. And then the European nations, I think David Alexander reminded me at one time when we were talking about Christian nationalism, that a large part of this, and going from sea to sea, a large part of this was because of world affairs. The British and the French were occupied with one another. The German state began in the 1850s, 1860s, and the Franco-Prussian War. So, I mean, we were the beneficiary of, if you will, the benign neglect in many respects. And so we could occupy a good part of the North American continent. In the 1820s and the 1830s and the early 1840s, and Linda is an expert on this, you had the rise of the Romantic period in American literature, the rise of a more open theology away from the sinners in the hands of an angry God of Jonathan Edwards, to another belief in natural law, nature, and reason. And out of this grew the abolitionist movement. And there were different types of abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison was primarily a flamethrower. He really didn't even believe in institutions initially. But putting the Liberator, which was the newspaper of the abolitionist movement, he did an amazing amount of spreading the word. But there were other abolitionists, namely Charles Grandison Finney, who is the founder of Oberlin College, which, by the way, still has the best anti-slavery abolitionist primary collection of any place in the United States. And I and a religion professor taught an interim course at Oberlin looking at the papers, and each student had to write a mini term paper. It was really fun, and Oberlin was very, very cooperative. But the major successful abolitionist in my point of view was Theodore Dwight Weld, who came out of Western New York, and he and others gradually worked their way into Pennsylvania and settled in the Western Reserve District of Northern Ohio. Theodore Dwight Weld was a political abolitionist. Initially, Garrison had nothing to do with politics. The institutions were corrupt. There's no way you could ever get abolishing slavery that way. But Weld said we have to concentrate on voting and build coalitions. And then when he married Angelina Grimke, you probably have heard of the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina. Their father was a plantation owner in South Carolina, but they became abolitionists and suffragettes in the 1830s. Angelina married Theodore Dwight Weld, and this was more like a merger than a marriage, because Grimke said, we have to concentrate on building coalitions and voting. This is what this country is based on. That's how you make decisions. And so eventually, that form of abolitionism basically transformed itself into first the Liberty Party, and then the Free Soil Party, and then the Republican Party. And the slogan of the Republican Party initially was free soil, free labor, free men. And it captured free soil because there was a contest who could get the most states and maybe take care of slavery gradually through voting it into oblivion. Free labor, the United States was an entrepreneurial country, especially in the North. And free men meant that the suffrage, the voting rights had expanded, especially to non-property holding white males. And what you had developing with Abraham Lincoln, who, in my opinion, is by far the best president that we have ever had, is that he felt that secession was a vote against democracy, and that if the majority spoke and the South seceded, it was against democracy, and that was, as Alice Roosevelt Longworth said, something up with which he could not put. That was the dividing line. And so after a long civil war in which General Grant finally appeared after a succession of mediocre generals, the United States won the Civil War, and the country became abolitionist because Lincoln pressed forward and got the 13th Amendment ratified. But at any rate, when asked about the Civil War, Lincoln said, I hope to have God on my side, but by God I had to have Kentucky. and that was really crucial. Now, to really get at the nub of what the Justice and Reconciliation Committee of our church wanted, is to have something in Black History Month that dealt with religion and slavery. Have the good fortune to have Linda Walvoord, who's, as you all know, is a member of our church. Linda's a graduate of Hope College as well. And I got to know her through my wife because they were in the same sorority as was my sister-in-law. And I was a Cosmo, and first time we could legally dance on campus was we had a mixer with the Delphis, which I asked another Delphi to go to lunch with me, and she said, well, I'm here with somebody else. I said, she has to be fixed up. And I said, hey, I got 40 guys here. I can definitely manage that. So the other person was Sandy. That's the last time I saw that other Delphi. And we've been married 60 years.
1963.
1963, a memorable year, right after the election of Kennedy. Yeah. And Linda has got a PhD in English from the University of Chicago, and she and I were in a group of people that John Hollenbach, who was the dean of the college at that time, put together because they wanted to encourage people to go into college teaching. And there were 4 or 5 of us, I believe. And most of the people went to the University of Chicago, except I chose the University of Michigan. And Linda asked me why, and I said, I like Big Ten football. My colleague, Linda. You got everything?
Thank you, thank you,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
All right, are we good? Can you hear? Well, thank you, Ron. Ron and I worked together to try to cover the history piece and remind ourselves of the things we went over in whatever learning we had about the lead up to the Civil War and the understanding of slavery. And so Ron cannot be with us next week, which is why he wanted to summarize for us the whole thing, including when the abolitionists really appear on the scene and have to persuade everybody in the country that we need to abolish slavery on a national basis. It had already been abolished in the northern states. So Ron went beyond, gave you the whole overview, which is great, because now we can look forward. So now I'm going to take you through some thoughts about how did the Reformed Church in the Netherlands and then in the colony behave when they first realized that slavery was coming to their settlement. Because when I was going to talk on this subject, when I first told my son, who's 51 and teaches high school history, that I was going to talk about the Reformed Church and slavery in the colonial era, he said, Mom, the only thing you can do is start with an apology. You have to start with an apology. And I said, well, I'm not going to whitewash anything. I'm going to, no. He said, you have to start with an apology. So we talked about it, and I understand this. We understand this, and that right now the teaching about slavery is in total a battleground, you know, among different factions who think you've got to make slavery nice for children because they can't deal with the dark side of slavery. You've got to not teach slavery at all. You've got to call them workers. You've got to call them workers. There's a children's book called The Bobbsey Twins in the Cotton Land of Cotton. And so the Bobbsey twins, for the one and only time that the Bobbsey twins ever went out of the West or New England, they never go south. But in the one, Bobbsey twins go to Cotton. You won't find the word slave. They do encounter some black people, but they're like nice, friendly people who take care of the horses, and they're out there picking the cotton to help the master. But they're workers. So that's the attitude that some people still want to whitewash and to go deeper. So it's very important that the culture as a whole consider now how we're going to deal with the teaching about slavery. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is concentrate on New York and New Jersey, and we know why that is, because New York and New Jersey are the only states in which the Reformed Church originally had churches, with just a few exceptions. We were concentrated in what became New York and New Jersey. New Netherland extended from Connecticut and went all the way down to where Delaware is and cut off a piece of Pennsylvania, but it shrank a little bit as time went by. So New York and New Jersey became the states that we'll be looking at as the United States forms. Now, when these settlers came here from the Netherlands, they had inherited a republic in the Netherlands, right? We know that there was the States General, which represented the 7 provinces. There was representative government, and even in the small towns of the Netherlands, the people could nominate 18 people, and whoever was in charge would choose 9 of those. So a council was formed that at least to some extent represented the will of the people. and then had some power. So they inherited a republic, and the one thing the Dutch people did was make sure on the ordinary people level that they were going to keep their republic. And if we hadn't been able overall to keep a republic, there would have been no way that slavery could have ever been taken back out of the United States. It has to have the will of the people in charge of the government as step one. That's the kindergarten level of finding a way. Otherwise, what powers can you find that will and can get rid of slavery? What were the powers bringing slavery here in the first place? The Dutch West or East India Company was the company that was given a charter to run New Netherland. The States General created the company in 1602 and said, here, then a little bit later, a company's going to come over here. What does a charter mean? It means you don't have to obey any of the rules that apply back home. You're starting over. The governor makes the rules. The governor raises a militia, because don't ask the Dutch government for any soldiers or for the money to build churches or anything else. And by the way, the company, the Dutch West India Company, are going to, help build churches, and you're going to select and hire and pay the ministers that are going over there. And you're going to go and consult with the classes of Amsterdam when you hire these ministers. And they're going to decide whether the minister's okay, and he's got to be ordained and everything. But between you and the classes of Amsterdam, you're going to send the ministers over. But remember, they're not going to listen to whoever pays them, right? So, and if you run out of money, anytime you run out of money, you can just raise it from the people. You can organize a tax. Because the States General has passed the buck big time to the Dutch West India Company. So what do we have? Ron took my notebook.
Oh, I wondered whose that was. I tried to give it away back here.
Okay, so we are squeezing in today part of what we will spill over to next week, because we could give you the history overview today. And then next week we will continue doing this. So
Yes, Mother, there is a goddess.
Okay, now I did prepare a handout, and I have enough for every 2 people to have one, which should work out fine, and we can get you another one by sending you a file this week. So if you would just distribute these, that would be great. Okay, that's good. Thank you. The power of the biggest and richest company in the world was now in play. And they were messing with the federal power. And they were taking over a lot of powers that belonged at the top and belonged in the hands of the people. But you have to be really careful when the most powerful and richest country in the world gets too big of a hand in your government. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so Adrian van der Donk, one of the heroes that we're going to talk about today, who is the hero of the book Island at the Center of the World, is the one who says, you know what we need to do first? Get the Dutch West India Company out of the picture, because they are the money grubbers and the profit makers and the people running this show, the ones who brought the slaves here, sort of by accident. The company brought the slaves. So the first 11 slaves arrived in about 1619. Well, why 11? Well, that's all there were on that ship. Well, where did that ship come from? We stole it from the Portuguese. See, we're at war with Spain and Portugal, and one of the rules of war says you can take their contraband any time. So you would get together some businessmen in Manhattan, they'd put some money together and hire a Dutch captain to go out at sea and see what they could capture. Finders keepers. Bring it all back to New York and sell it for what you can get, and that belongs to whoever you set up it was going to belong to. So the first slaves come here sort of by accident. On that ship there could have been tobacco, rum, rice, coffee, whatever they were porting around. Oh, plus 11 slaves. So 11 came in 1719, and probably no one ordered them. They were just part of the booty that came in that way. And now they're in New Netherland.
And they were African slaves.
I mean,
They were African.
they were African. Well, they spoke Portuguese. And so, did anybody order them? So were they put on the auction block? Or did they go right into the work gangs of the Dutch West India Company? Well, probably the company took them for their work gangs, because the most common thing that we're told the slaves would be doing is building roads and fortifications and buildings, and not sent right to some farms for the farmers to have. Now, between 1619 and 1664, when Peter Stuyvesant hands over the keys to New Netherland to the British ships that are out in the harbor ready to shoot if you don't. That's the end of the Dutch reign in New Netherlands. So we have from 1619 to 1664. After that, the Dutch are not in charge. Well, they are on the side. In a way, they are. Because all they really did in 1664 was change the flag, and all the pain and nuisance of administration passed to the English, and no property was lost, and no churches were closed, and nobody was kicked out of their business. It was just business as usual. All the Dutch people stayed there. And the Dutch Reformed Church was still safe, and they might even get some tax money now from the Church of England now and then, which might be better than what they're getting from the Classes of Amsterdam, which is practically nothing except theological oversight. So the number of slaves that were in the colony at the time Peter Stuyvesant turned over the keys was about 300. That's all. And how many people were there in the colony? Well, in the meantime, one of these terrible governors that they had a whole string of had started a war with the Indians. And the Indians had paid them back. And the population was reduced from 3,000 in 1643 to 1,000. Some were killed, a lot were killed, and others were so terrified they went to another colony or went back to the Netherlands. So just when your investment was starting to do something at a very early time, bam, you lose 2/3 of it. This is not good, is it? So now we're starting over with about 1,000 people. And then after the Indian Wars were concluded, there was a very golden 10 or 15 years when Vanderdonk's creation helped assistance in creating a body of law and an orderly way for complaint of grievances, and a right of assembly, and a right to complain, and a method of appeal, an ability to appeal. Almost every one of the 10 Bill of Rights that we're hearing ticked off here is beginning to be created in this middle colony to build on the republic they inherited in the first place, and the possibly greater freedom that came in the Netherlands for ordinary people, because there was not that tyrannical, dictatorial governor standing in the way, and the ridiculous, bloodthirsty, profit-seeking Dutch East India Company. So in your handout, you'll find the first few pages being, number one, a little more information about the Dutch company and how big it was, how bloody it was. And what the scholars are telling us now is that New Netherland was the only one of the Dutch trading posts that turned into a real settlement and a full society. Otherwise, it was business as usual in everything you needed to continue the trading post, but the Dutch West India Company and we East was not that interested in going into settlements, because where's the profit in that? So New Netherland has a particular history because of the way all this unfolded. Another thing I'd like you to be able to read, if you would like to go that far, is the 6th chapter of Island at the Center of the World, which is called the Council of Blood. And it really summarizes beautifully and very well written that central thesis that comes from Russell Shorto. What I've just said in the last few minutes is really Russell Shorto's view of all this that he has put together in Island. How many of you have read Island at the Center of the World? I understand that Russell Shorto was here in Holland before I came back to Holland and gave talks and everything. That would have been wonderful. But I learned about it from Elton Bruins, who over at Third Church said to me, "You've got to read Island at the Center of the World with your interests." And that was my trigger, that what a great book this is. So the States General in the Netherlands meets the Dutch East India Company was not a happy thing, but it was a necessary thing at the time. Now, back here in the Reformed Church, did we have a republic in the church? Well, yeah, in a way. Why? One word: elders. Who runs the church if you can't get a minister? The elders. Who, if you're too poor to hire a minister, because he has to be trained over in the Netherlands, and then the elders are in charge. So by 1664, would you like to guess if they have around now? Donald Brugging thinks that by 1664, when the keys get handed over to England, how many people do you think there were in the population of the Netherlands? Like, are you going to guess between 2,000 and 5,000? 7,000 or more, or something like 20,000? Well, if it was reduced to 1,000 by that Indian War,
Yeah.
and then they rebuilt and had a good century, we're going to say, Brugging says probably 2,000. And if out of that 300 were slaves, we have a 15% slave population in that part of in New Netherland. Now, how many churches, how many Reformed churches do we have?
3,000. One on every corner.
Well, that's our image of New England. We're a church on every corner and a minister in every church who's at least at the level of Cotton Mather, you know.
Yes, of course.
Or better.
Yeah.
And there were 13 churches and only 4 ministers. And 2 of those ministers left shortly after the keys were turned over. So what are we left with?
Wow.
If you ever heard of a shortage of ministers, this is it. Because we were an orphan church. Nobody took care of us. Nobody. When that buck was passed from the Classes of Amsterdam over to the States General, and then from the States General to the Dutch West India Company, there was going to be a shortage of ministers. And what about the quality of ministers? Well, that's another point. So for the next, do we have until 10:30 or a little bit later?
10:40.
Oh, 10:40. Okay, so we have a few minutes. And what I did in the handout was to suggest you have the apology issued by the government of the Netherlands, just in 2022, because this is big now, apologies, as my son said. So you'll be able to look at the apology that embraces everything. And it's kind of interesting to say, what do they confess and what don't they confess in that apology, and how is it handled? And then, how did the Reformed Church ever issue an apology? Well, this is what the Belhar Confession is all about, that the Reformed Church adopted as a creed, right up there in importance with the Heidelberg Catechism and everything else. We now have the Belhar Confession, which came out of South Africa at the time that apartheid ended, and as an apology for apartheid. And so the Reformed Church then, through the whole process of having every classis, accept it as central, we do use, you'll probably see it in the bulletin from time to time, the words of the Belhar Confession of the sinfulness that is involved in the slavery. What about the education of slaves? The education of slaves is the key to their ability to become free. And one of the other elements in the development of slavery in the colonial times is, did the ministers have slaves? Yes. Did the main elders and members of the Reformed Church own slaves? Yes. Was that true in New England? Yes. Was it true in Virginia that really pious Christians who considered themselves right in there as leaders of the church owned slaves? Of course, yes. How did that ever change? And what were the results of that? Well, there's a great deal, it matters a great deal whether there are some free slaves in your part of the country. If you can see even one freed slave who is making it himself and able to function and able to support and become an educated, more educated and assimilated citizen, then you can't say that nobody can do it. You can't hold on to your favorite prejudice that justified slavery if you have some free population in your midst. Now I'm going to jump ahead to the life of Frederick Douglass. When Frederick Douglass came to Baltimore and joined the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, it was all black. It was all black people trying to achieve mental improvement. He was the only one that was a slave. This was in about the 1820s. He was the only one that was a slave in Baltimore, and he was the only one who could read. And that's where he met his wife, Anna, because she was a housemaid, but she belonged to the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, organized and run by illiterate slaves trying to take a step up. When you have something like that in your midst, a lot is being questioned and a lot is happening. The farmers, as you know, slavery then, if it's 15% of your population, then the slaves are very scattered. They're in different places, so they're under a farmer. But are they? Well, they didn't. Agriculture in New York and New Jersey isn't year-round. It's winter sometimes in New York and New Jersey. So is it economically, does it make sense? By the time so it's going to be interesting to watch the role of the citizens of New York who are feeding into the political movements at state level. Because by 1790, both New York and New Jersey had set in motion the end of slavery at their state legislature level. The state legislatures had, after a lot of back and forth and discussion of the future of the country, had not freed the slaves all at once, but had set in motion this staged by age or by group who would be set free in what order. So by 1827, the last of the slaves in New York were freed by state law. That meant that leading up to that, if you owned slaves right around 1800, you knew you weren't going to have them for very much longer. And when they were going to be freed, they would have to go somewhere and do something. So if you can put them in a situation where they will learn English, or they will learn a trade, or they will be able to do something that will enable them to go out and survive. Otherwise, one way or another, the government's going to put them back on you and make them welfare recipients. And as a matter of fact, when we get to Dinah Van Hardenberg, who wants to get rid of her slaves in about 1770, in the 1770s. If she were to set them free, she'd have to pay a bond of hundreds of dollars. Because the government's not just, the city of Holland's not going to let you just turn a slave free on the street who can't take care of himself. He'll be on the welfare rolls. I mean, St. Paul even says, you know, your widows should be allowed to remarry because otherwise they'll wind up on the welfare rolls of the church. And we wouldn't want that to happen, so let them remarry. Well, you got to deal with the situation that you're in. And so the education of the slaves is extremely important, and they know it by 1795. And many farmers and ordinary people in the small towns had exposed the slaves to some education that would enable them to move forward. Now let's take a look at the plantation system that for a while they tried to create in New York. As you probably know, they had these patroons. And the whole country called Rensselaer-Wyke, surrounding Albany, was the area that Kilian van Rensselaer, a diamond merchant in Amsterdam, diamonds and pearls, very wealthy, became a patroon with the approval over there to take over this whole area that included Albany. And he was supposed to provide settlers and make a deal with farmers that he could bring over so that they could produce goods. And that's starting to sound like a plantation, isn't it? Maybe he's going to be tempted to people his area with slaves. He can afford to buy some slaves. Couldn't he do that? He doesn't. But on the other hand, the patroon system doesn't work in New York. Thank God. The patroons of a plantation-like structure that was taking hold in the South. In other words, in the South you had cotton and tobacco and heavy manual labor crops, but in the North that wasn't going to work. If you take a look in your handout, I think you'll see a page that describes Rensselaer van Wyk and describes exactly what the deal was that Kilian van Rensselaer was offering to these farmers, many of whom were elders in the Reformed churches. Would you take this deal? Okay, here's the deal. Let's see if can you find it in your... The patroon is going to provide you your trip across the ocean. And when you get here, he's going to give you a house and a barn and a plow one time, a wagon one time, and 4 horses one time, and 4 cows one time. Okay, ready to go? Now, you'll raise your crop, and here's the deal about the crop, which you will share. This is called what? Sharecropping, okay. He's offering sharecropping. And the words are hilarious. Donald Burger King includes the whole thing right out of the mouth of Kilian van Rensselaer, as Van Rensselaer is trying to persuade Megapolensis to come and be his minister in this colony. Domini Megapolensis is very well trained, and he is a very important colonial minister. He's really in the lead. So he's sending this to Megapolensis because he wants to assure, here's the deal that you'll have as the minister in the colony. Because Megapolensis is saying, well, where's my salary coming from? And here's capitalism at work. Let's see, where is this? I think it's in your thing. It's here. Okay. Here's the way Megapolensis puts it. And I think we'll close with this and leave a few minutes for...
You pushed it. That's what everybody's seeing now on the TV.
Oh, okay.
Push the button and it moves.
All right. I'm really not using I think we'll use the PowerPoint next week to open. And you'll have an opportunity. I'd like you to have the opportunity, if you'd like, take this home with you this week, look it over, and we'll continue next week, because you'll be able to look at a few things and develop questions, and we'll pick up where we left off next week. Here's what Van Rensselaer says to Megapolensis to convince him that he's going to be all right. Each farmer must take with him at least 2 servants and 1 boy who understands farming, and equip them himself. The patroon, on his part, provides their board until they arrive in New Netherland at the island of Manhattan, and on their arrival in the colony causes them to be provided upon condition of repayment. In other words, this is a loan. With grain for eating and sowing, and with a suitable site on which to establish their farm. The patroon will have built for them a good house, a hay barrack, barn, which according to the custom of the country are usually placed near the river, the waters of which flow by clear and fresh and full of fish. The patroon causes them also to be provided once with the wagon and plow, and what else is needed for farming. He will further assign them some land in the interior, containing excellent game such as deer, turkeys, and sorrel, all sort of nourishing fowl. Look how your wife can go fishing and shoot fowl and turkeys and so forth in the woods. He also turns over to them from the surplus of animals in the colony 4 horses and 4 cows, of which they are to have half the offspring, the other half to be paid to the patroon in money or in kind. Each farmer there can, with little capital or advance of money, establish himself as pleasantly and as fully as the best nobleman in the Dutch country. You too can be a nobleman. As to the rent which the patroon derives from all this, he reserves to himself, in the first place, the right of the tithes. So the first 10% goes to the patroon off the top as a tithe. For the support of the political and ecclesiastical persons, and whomever he shall see fit. Okay, what does that say? Well, don't worry, Megapolensis. Your salary's coming out of that tithe of the first 10% that the patroon's going to take off of all these crops that are going to be sold in New Netherland. Then every third sheaf of the remaining crop, so a third of the remainder, so you went down to 90%, and then that was divided in thirds. And now the farmer gets to keep 2 of those thirds, and the patroon takes the other third. And out of the farmer's 2/3, you have to pay your wages to your servants if they are being paid wages, and other expense, and finally, the right to sell surplus animals. So, George, what do you think of that as a business plan?
As always, it works to the advantage of the person who has the money.
That's right. And the word assign, what does that mean? So the farmer comes over here and he says to the patroon, well, when are you going to give me the deed to this land? I've been working for you. Who said you were getting a deed? Didn't you read the contract? Don't you know that you're a sharecropper? Don't you know that you never get the deed? You're not ever, ever, ever going to own the land. And that's buried in the deal. It's right there in the wording of the contract. But how many of those farmers hoped or thought or abandoned the thing altogether? And Donald Brookings says, when the people got to New York and started talking to people, they decided to heck with Rensselaer. I've got a job right here. I can find something better that I can do. And he had a huge dropout rate when people even got to Manhattan. And then wait until the Indians start attacking your villages and you're one of the patroon's people. You can just see that it's just rife with possibility of failure. And when Michaelius came here, I have to tell you about the fates of the first few ministers. One of the things we're looking for is the ability of a clergyman to speak truth to power, right? We want those clergymen to be brave in the interests of what the Bible indicates in terms of justice. Well, Michaelius was kicked out in less than 3 years for getting in an argument with the governor, for criticizing the governor, yay, and he had a fight with an elder. Well, that's not that unusual either. But he contradicted an elder, got in a fight with an elder, and he criticized the government, and they yanked him back to the Netherlands. But he had fallen in love with the colony, and he wanted to go back. And the Dutch India Company said, no, you're not going back. He wasn't permitted to come back when he wanted to. Now, Russell Shorto considers Michaelius the nastiest person he ever heard of. He insulted the slaves, he insulted the Indians, he didn't think anybody was any good. But poor Michaelius, on the ship over, his wife was pregnant and she died shortly after they got here in childbirth. So now he is the single father of 2 children, and he's dependent on somebody like, on what? So he goes back, and his salary was never properly paid. And eventually Megapolensis, who did such a wonderful job up around Albany, becoming that minister that Killian Van Rensselaer was looking for. He served partly in Albany and partly in New Amsterdam, but he too went home because his salary hadn't been paid. So the tradition of not paying your ministers was alive and well, one way or another, in the colonial world. Don, how many missionaries that you ever heard of were kind of low paid back in the old days?
They were paid according to what was the going rate in the countries in which they lived.
Not too good. All right, so, and then I think we'll pick up on this next week. And next week, I'm very grateful to Ron Mulder for having given you the historical overview. And now next week, we will cover the rest of what is in some things from your handout. If you would rather leave the handout here, we will use it again next week. So either take it home with you and bring it back, or put it up here on the seat and we'll save them for next week. And I will go through the PowerPoint next week at the beginning, because we don't have any more time right now, right?
Correct. We don't have time for questions and answers. So we will hope that next week, Linda might leave a little time for
Yes.
questions and answers as well.
Actually, we'll start with questions and answers next week, because we had to change the time allocation this time for the historical summary.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ron and Linda. Yes. And I understand, you look at page 13 in the worship bulletin, there's a description for next week as well. I understand we'll go up to like 1870 next week. So yes, please. And I understand there weren't enough of Linda's handouts, so if I can get like a master copy, I will take those to the office and we will make some more copies, additional copies as well, and make those available.
If you'd like to have it as a file, too, let us know and you can see it in your email.
Okay, yeah, we could maybe make a link. Okay. All right, check that. Thank you very much.